Most people think of World War II as a contest of machines, numbers, and grand strategy, air power versus air power. What is far less remembered is that for millions of soldiers, the most persistent and dangerous enemy was not the opposing army, but the cold itself. Hypothermia quietly disabled more troops than bullets in several campaigns, shaping outcomes without ever appearing on maps or victory reports. This was not a marginal problem on the edges of the war. It was central, systemic, and often ignored until the damage was already done. Soldiers survived not because they were well equipped, but because they adapted with whatever materials, habits, and knowledge they could improvise under pressure. Cold was not an accident of geography, but a failure of planning and assumptions. Before the war, most European armies still believed campaigns would be short, decisive, and seasonally constrained. Winter warfare was considered an exception rather than a norm. Uniforms, supply chains, and medical doctrine reflected that assumption. When the war expanded into Eastern Europe, the Arctic, high mountains, and long winter stalemates, soldiers found themselves exposed to cold conditions their institutions had not prepared them for. Hypothermia was often misunderstood as simple discomfort or fatigue, not as a medical emergency that degraded judgment, motor control, and combat effectiveness. In many armies, early symptoms were dismissed as weakness. Soldiers who became slow, confused, or withdrawn were assumed to be malingering or exhausted. By the time command structures recognized hypothermia as a tactical problem, tens of thousands had already been lost to cold injury. These losses rarely appeared in heroic narratives, yet they forced armies to rethink how humans actually function in prolonged exposure to cold. On the Eastern Front, survival depended less on equipment and more on routine discipline. Nowhere was cold more lethal than on the Eastern Front. German forces entered the Soviet Union in 1941, equipped for a summer campaign that was supposed to end before winter. When temperatures plunged, entire units became immobilized. Weapons froze, fuel thickened, and frostbite cases surged. Yet German soldiers who survived often did so through small, almost invisible practices rather than official issue gear. Men learned to keep moving at regular intervals, not for warmth alone, but to preserve circulation. They rotated sentries more frequently than regulations required. They slept in shifts, sharing body heat in tight quarters whenever possible. Improvised insulation became critical. Newspapers, straw, rags, and even bark were layered inside boots and uniforms. Soldiers wrapped feet in cloth rather than socks to avoid constriction, an old peasant method rediscovered out of necessity. These practices were not heroic gestures, they were quiet adaptations passed soldier to soldier. Units that enforced discipline around warmth, movement, and dryness consistently outperformed those that relied on issued gear alone. The lesson was stark doctrine failed, but habit and peer knowledge filled the gap. The Red Army's experience revealed how cultural familiarity with cold could be weaponized. Soviet soldiers were not immune to hypothermia, but many had grown up working outdoors in severe winters. This cultural familiarity shaped how they approached cold survival. They understood the danger of sweat freezing, the importance of layering loosely, and, well, the value of shelter, even when it was pretty crude. Dugouts were reinforced not for comfort, but for heat retention. Fires were managed carefully to reduce smoke while still maintaining warmth. Footwear was a critical advantage. Felt Valenki boots, though primitive by Western standards, provided superior insulation when dry. Soviet troops prioritized keeping them dry above all else, even if it meant sacrificing speed or convenience. The Red Army also institutionalized lessons quickly. Winter camouflage insulated uniforms, and cold-weather tactics became standardized faster than in many Western armies. This was not romantic resilience. It was an adaptation forged through prior hardship and bitter learning. The Soviets demonstrated that cold-weather competence was not merely logistical but cultural, something learned over generations and reinforced by necessity. In mountainous and Arctic theatres, improvisation became doctrine in practice, if not exactly on paper. In Norway, the Alps, and along the Arctic convoy routes, cold combined with wind and isolation to produce conditions where, honestly, survival margins were razor-thin. Allied troops operating in these regions faced constant heat loss even when they were just sitting still. Issued equipment was often, inadequate, and resupply could be pretty unreliable. So, soldiers turned to field-expedient solutions that, interestingly enough, later influenced formal training. Snow caves, dug quickly with minimal tools, provided better insulation than tents ever could. Layers of spruce boughs beneath sleeping areas helped reduce conductive heat loss. Cooking and melting snow inside shelters raised the ambient temperature a bit, while also providing much-needed hydration. Grease, oil, or even candle wax was rubbed into boots and gloves to reduce moisture penetration. These weren't just acts of desperation. They were systematic responses, refined through repetition. Units that documented and shared these methods actually reduced non-combat losses significantly. After the war, many of these techniques were incorporated into cold-weather survival manuals, really proving that frontline improvisation often came before institutional acceptance. Medical understanding of hypothermia evolved because the war made ignorance just way too costly. Early in the war, hypothermia was honestly pretty poorly understood, even by military doctors. Treatment protocols were inconsistent, and, rewarming methods were sometimes actually harmful. Soldiers were brought too quickly into heated spaces, leading to shock or even cardiac complications. Others were left untreated simply because they were still conscious and assumed to be stable. As cases mounted, military medicine was really forced to adapt. Gradual rewarming, dry insulation, and careful handling became the standard. The recognition that hypothermia actually impaired decision-making helped commanders reinterpret battlefield behavior. Soldiers who failed to follow orders in extreme cold were no longer automatically punished. Sometimes they were evacuated instead. This shift really mattered beyond the war. Post-war research into cold exposure, survival physiology, and rescue medicine drew heavily from wartime data. Modern understanding of hypothermia as a systemic progressive condition owes so much to lessons learned under fire. Small leadership decisions often determined whether cold destroyed a unit or just, merely slowed it. Commanders who treated cold as a secondary concern paid for it in manpower. But those who adjusted routines, enforced rest cycles, and prioritized shelter actually preserved combat effectiveness. Something as simple as allowing extra time to dry clothing or rotate positions could honestly mean the difference between a functioning unit and one collapsing silently. These decisions were rarely glamorous. They did not appear in after-action reports unless failure occurred. Yet they shaped outcomes just as surely as firepower. Cold punished rigidity and rewarded attentiveness. Leaders who listened to experienced soldiers and adapted regulations to conditions performed better than those who enforced doctrine blindly. This reality influenced post-war military training. Flexibility, environmental awareness, and decentralized decision-making became more emphasized, particularly in cold-weather units. The war demonstrated that human limits are as real as logistical ones. The broader lesson is that survival often depends on neglected details rather than grand strategy. World War II's cold weather struggles remind us that wars are fought not only by plans and technology, but by bodies under stress. Hypothermia exposed the gap between theory and reality, between institutional confidence and environmental truth. Soldiers survived by understanding heat, moisture, movement, and rest long before these were fully codified. For modern survivalists and historians alike, these stories matter because they reveal how knowledge travels in crises. It moves horizontally between peers before it ever moves vertically into doctrine. It rewards humility and observation over assumption. The forgotten war against cold was won not by innovation alone, but by attention to fundamentals. Remembering these experiences matters because they resist easy narratives. They remind us that endurance is often quiet, uncelebrated, and rooted in practical wisdom. If you value this kind of grounded, in-depth historical analysis, consider subscribing to Iron Age Instincts and sharing this video with others who want more than surface-level history.